morning. It's Sunday, September 27. I'd like to continue to reflect with you on something that I reflected with you on last Sunday's message about God's prevenient grace, how God is always with us, how God in His loving kindness meets us at every corner, and how all of the unexpected twists and turns in our lives, while confusing at times, are all part of God's hidden and mysterious will for our lives, that He has a good plan and good purpose that He's working out in His way and in His time. And so I'd like to read a passage with you now from Acts chapter 16. It might seem a little technical and obscure. It chronicles some of the Apostle Paul's intentions for his missionary journeys. But in this passage, we're going to also see how, in spite of the change of Paul's plans and itinerary, God was at work, closing some doors, but opening others. Let's hear these words recorded in Acts 16, verses 6 through 10. Paul and his companions traveled throughout the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel there. Years ago, I read a sermon based on that passage, preached by a man named Harry Emerson Fosdick. Many of you are probably not familiar with that name, but he was a very prolific preacher, popular writer, served for many years as the pastor at Riverside Church, which is a prominent church in New York City, Gothic-style architecture, a huge cathedral-like building that's situated on the side of the Hudson River in New York. I have a collection of his sermons, and one of the sermons that I read is based on this passage in Acts 16, and the sermon is titled Handling Life's Second Bests. It's an intriguing sermon because Harry Emerson Fosdick uses the example of the Apostle Paul, as recorded in the words that I just read to you, as sort of a template for our lives. How we, as he experienced, often find ourselves in places we don't expect. We have to handle life's second bests. Our first options are not given to us. Paul wanted to go to Bithynia, but that door was closed, and so he settled by going to Troas instead. And Fosdick uses that experience to connect with the experiences that we all have at one point or another. We have plans, ambitions, hopes, and dreams, many of which never seem to materialize. We too want to go to Bithynia, but end up in Troas. And initially we experience some level of disappointment with that. I mean, we aren't getting what we wanted. We aren't going where we intended to go. Life has an unexpected detour. It might have to do with a job that we wanted that we never got, or a love interest that was never reciprocated, or maybe things are going really well for us and then all of a sudden there's some unexpected illness or some significant change in our lives. We settle for second best. We want Bithynia, but end up in Troas. Paul must have wondered why the door to Bithynia was closed, Fosdick wonders. It was one of the richest provinces in Asia Minor, and to have carried Christianity there would have been a triumph indeed. But how often isn't it true, he goes on to explain, that what we think is a disappointment or a loss, a second-best option, turns out to be a very good experience, one where we encounter the grace and loving kindness of God that meets us at every corner, including those unexpected places where we never intended to be. We see that clearly in Acts 16, and we see it in our own lives, wanting Bithynia and getting Troas. Is there anyone here who has not wanted Bithynia and gotten Troas? Fosdick asks his audience. I'm sure you've experienced that. And it's something that we will have to face perhaps even more frequently as the COVID pandemic goes on, with a lot of interrupted plans. As we look back on the summer of 2020, we can all probably point to plans that never materialized, a wedding that had to be postponed, a trip that was canceled. What do we do with all of these second best options that are given to us? I remember when I was in seminary, back in the late 1980s, I was nearing the end of my second year of study there. The 4 years of seminary education was structured in such a way that students would be 2 years in school, and then they would go to church for 1 year of internship after that, and then return to seminary for their final year of study. So everyone in my class, nearing the end of our second year, was preparing to go out to a church somewhere for a year-long internship. And all the churches that had decided they would want an intern were posted on a bulletin board in the field education office. And you could sign up to be interviewed by churches that you hoped to have an internship there. And I remember standing in the field education office one day, looking up at all the sheets that were posted on the board, and I had signed up to be interviewed by 3 churches. Those were my top 3 choices. And a professor of mine walked into the office at that moment and stood beside me, and he looked up at the bulletin board as I did, and he looked to see all of the sheets where I had signed my name, and I can still picture him saying, Ontario, Ontario, Ontario. He knew that I was from Ontario. And he said, you know, this internship opportunity is giving you a chance to spread your wings. Do something different. Don't go back home. Find a place or a ministry opportunity that will really challenge you, that will be really life-changing perhaps. And then with that, he pointed to another option, another sheet on the bulletin board. It was an internship opportunity at the Crystal Cathedral in California, Robert Schuller's church. There was a Christian Reformed pastor on staff there. His entire ministry was involved in pastoral care, and the internship opportunity would be almost exclusively on pastoral care. It would have been a wonderful experience, I'm sure, but I knew that it wasn't for me. I wanted to go to a church that would give me an opportunity to preach and to experience a full range of ministry opportunities. And my professor, as he pointed that sheet out to me, said, if you sign up for that opportunity in the Crystal Cathedral, I'll put a good word in for you. I thought about it for a moment. I tried to imagine what it would be like to be there, but I knew it just wasn't for me. I knew that I, as a young 22-year-old, would not have an opportunity to preach there, not in Robert Schuller's church. Me, on the hour of power, that just wasn't going to happen. And I was perfectly fine with that. But the point I'm getting to here is that none of the 3 churches that I had signed up to be interviewed by wanted me. All the doors to Bithynia were closed. And so I had to settle for another option. And the option that I ended up settling for, the Troas that I ended up going to, ended up being a really enriching experience, a wonderful opportunity that really enabled me to grow in ways that I might not have experienced in any other place. I wanted Bithynia, ended up in Troas, and it ended up being a very good thing. Initially, of course, there is disappointment in all of that, all of the second bests. But when you begin to see that God is at work in and through all of those experiences, you feel incredibly reassured, upheld, guided by an unseen hand. It makes you realize that nothing in life happens by chance or because of luck. There's a purpose behind everything. There's a person behind every experience. It's something that Harry Emerson Fosdick also pointed out in his autobiography. As he wrote the story of his life, he notes on many occasions how God was guiding every aspect of it. How even in what many would consider to be random experiences and chance encounters with people to help someone in need, really proved to have an incredible impact on people's lives. He writes about one particular experience when a disheveled homeless man wandered into Riverside Church one evening and heard Harry Emerson Fosdick preach. He was so inspired by the message, he decided then and there to make some important changes in his life. He quit drinking. He went back to school. This took many years, but he eventually graduated. He got a job. He became a very successful businessman. Fosdick would have known none of this were it not for a chance meeting in a hotel lobby years later, when this individual recognized him, introduced himself, and told Harry Emerson Fosdick about what happened in that church that evening many years before, when he, living a life where it seemed so many doors were closed, suddenly saw one opening, and he walked through it. A chance meeting? A random encounter? Or was it all guided by an unseen hand, a loving God? I actually have Harry Emerson Fosdick's autobiography, The Living of These Days. I'm intrigued by this book for many reasons, not the least of which is the fact that Harry Emerson Fosdick inscribed it to a Mrs. Mortimer St. Stessa, I think it is. Harry's penmanship isn't all that great. But I read this inscription and thought, how great is it that the story of this man's life was held in his own hands, this particular volume, inscribed by him, and somehow it found its way into my hands. I wonder about that a lot, for instance, when I'm in used bookstores and I find books that somehow make their way into my hands, books that I needed, particularly at that moment, or books that became helpful in ways that I could not have expected. Just random discoveries, or given to me by some unseen hand. We all know what it is like to experience disappointment and loss, twists and turns, unexpected detours, but how good it is to know that God is the one guiding, closing doors, but also opening them. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer put it in that wonderful phrase that I used in my Compass Point message from a few days ago, God has a crooked yet straight path. People often say everything happens for a reason, and that's true. But of course, the hard thing is to try to figure out what that reason is. There are so many things that happen in our lives that we don't understand and never will. It can be so confusing, so heartbreaking to see why some doors are closed, doors that, from our perspective, seem to be altogether good and which would enable us, as Paul must have thought, to really make a difference in the world. How is it that they are closed? How is it that we hurt sometimes, so heartbreakingly so? I think of the passing of Nick Cordero, a promising actor. He passed away a few months ago, this past July, from COVID. He contracted the coronavirus somehow back in March of this year, early in the stages of this pandemic, when he was visiting New York City. A promising actor, born in Hamilton, Ontario, my hometown, a place where a lot of important and gifted people are born in. Not referring to myself, of course, but it's true. A lot of great people were born in Hamilton, as Nick Cordero was. I read an interview with his wife in the New York Times just the other day. His wife, Amanda Klutz, was asked to help readers understand her experiences and the impact that it is having on her. What is your best understanding of how Nick got COVID? The interviewer asked Amanda. And her response, it's almost impossible to know. I asked the doctor that many a time. It's impossible to pinpoint. She goes on to describe how unusual it was that COVID hit Nick so hard, only 41 years old, in good health. This, she says, is something that I will rack my brain about sometimes at night. It's not fair. It just felt like he couldn't catch a break. Nick just got trapped. I think it would be different if he went to the hospital now, referring to how things have improved later on in the subsequent months and how the pandemic victims were treated. What do you do with all of that, with all of those closed doors, all of those unanswered questions, with the reality that things just don't make sense and probably never will? Is it all just a series of random, meaningless events? Is that the story of our lives? Well, Amanda doesn't believe that. In the interview, she also spoke about her faith in God. I grew up Lutheran, she said, and I've been pretty religious my entire life. I've always prayed, and I don't know how I would have gotten through all of this without my faith and prayer. There were times when doctors told Amanda that Nick wasn't going to make it. And she said then she would pray hard and Nick would fight and he would hold on. But one of the times that happened, she said, I was praying and I said, God, thy will be done. I will never understand if you take him, but it isn't my will, it's your will. And there it is. So many unanswered questions, closed doors, unending sorrow. But somehow all of this mystery is wrapped up in the goodness of God, in the unseen hand of God that guides and upholds and blesses. How good it is for us to know that, to be reassured by the prevenient grace of God, who closes doors but opens doors. And sometimes, in God's providence, we are given an opportunity to see exactly why some things happened, why this door was closed, and why that door opened. I think of Tim Keller, wonderful pastor, now retired, founding pastor at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City. I had a chance encounter with him in New York one night. I don't have time to go into all of that now, but again, I don't believe it was just a random encounter. It was a literal meeting by accident. If you want me to tell you more about that, ask me and I'll share the story sometime. But he used to love to tell the story about how Redeemer Presbyterian Church came to be. It's a marvelous testimony to the providence of God. He would talk to his listeners on a Sunday evening or morning, and he would ask them this question, do you know why you were here? And he would go on to tell the story of how Redeemer got established. It all goes back to his journey as a young man, discovering that God called him to become a Presbyterian pastor. How did that come to be? Well, it's because he went to a particular seminary. He wasn't Presbyterian by upbringing, grew up in a nominal Lutheran home, but he went to a Presbyterian seminary and he was really impacted by a visiting professor, a professor from Great Britain, who was having some difficulty returning to the seminary because of some visa problems. He wasn't going to be able to return because of his difficulty in obtaining a visa. This is in 1975. He did end up getting to the seminary after all because there was a student there who had some connections. He knew what kind of strings to pull when it came to giving this professor a visa. That student's name was Michael Ford, son of President Gerald Ford. Well, how is it that Gerald Ford got to be president? Well, as many of you know, it's because a bunch of burglars broke into the Watergate Hotel and were caught. How were they caught? It's because one of the burglars happened to leave a door open. A night watchman, security guard walking through the halls knew that he had closed that door, but when he saw that that door was open, had been left ajar by one of the burglars, he knew that something was up. He walked in later, he noticed the door was open just a little bit, and this was the thing that set in motion all of the events that led to the resignation of Richard Nixon from the presidency due to the Watergate scandal. Tim's conclusion to this illustration is the following statement: Watergate happened for you. If that guy had just closed the door, we wouldn't be here tonight. That's an incredible story. There's an open door, one that was left open. Don't ever think that God does not leave a door open for you. We tend to focus on the doors that are shut, the doors that close, that we wish wouldn't close, but are closed. But always look for the open door. Even if it's not Bithynia, go to Troas. Walk in that open door that God has left open for you. You'll meet him there. God, in his loving grace and kindness, will meet you at every corner, even there. I hope this message has given you some encouragement, some assurance. I look forward to sharing more messages with you as we continue to think about God's presence in our lives. I encourage you to share this message with others for whom you think it might be helpful. In the meantime, as we continue to make our way through these uncertain times, let's be assured of God's loving kindness, his never-failing promises. Be well and be blessed.